The town of Caldwell Creek had a habit of deciding things fast. Fast trials, fast verdicts, fast rope. The kind of fast that felt like justice to men who'd never been on the wrong end of it. Nora Hale had lived in Caldwell Creek her whole life, 23 years of watching the town move like a river that only flowed one direction and crushed anything that tried to swim against it. She'd watched her father lose his ranch to a land dispute decided by a judge who owed favors to the wrong people. She'd watched her brother leave at 17 because staying meant becoming something he didn't want to be. She'd watched the town elect sheriffs and hang men and call it order when what it really was, most of the time, was convenience dressed up in legal language that sounded righteous if you didn't look too closely at the details. She knew exactly how Caldwell Creek worked, which was why she didn't believe a single word of what they were saying about Cole Briggs. Cole had ridden into the territory 8 months ago with a bedroll, a decent horse, and a reputation for honest work that had preceded him from 2 counties south. He'd hired on at the Lattimore Ranch as a hand, nothing more, nothing less. Showed up before sunrise, did what he was told without complaint or commentary. Didn't drink to excess, or start fights, or chase trouble the way some men did when the nights got long and the work got monotonous, and the territory started feeling less like opportunity and more like a sentence. Nora had met him twice, once at the general store when he'd held the door open without making a performance of it, just a quiet courtesy extended without expectation of acknowledgement or reward. Once at the Lattimore fence line, when she'd been riding her father's old boundary in the early spring, and he'd been fixing posts that the winter had heaved loose from frozen ground. They'd talked for maybe 20 minutes about nothing that mattered. Weather patterns, cattle prices, whether the spring grass was coming in thick enough after the dry fall to support the herd numbers Lattimore was running on that section. He'd been quiet, deliberate with his words, the kind of man who listened more than he talked and chose what he said carefully enough that when he finally spoke, it meant something. Not the kind of man who killed. Not the kind of man who'd put a bullet in Deputy Warren Hicks behind the feed store on a Tuesday night and leave him face down in the dirt, bleeding out between the barrels and the back wall, where nobody would find him until morning. But the town had decided otherwise. Cole's horse had been found tied 2 streets over from the feed store. Cole's bandana, red cotton, distinctive enough that 3 people identified it immediately, had been found near Hicks's body. Cole himself had been found sleeping in the livery 3 hours after the shooting, which the prosecutor stood up and called deeply suspicious, and which Cole, when given the chance to respond, called the natural consequence of 14 hours of post-hole digging in ground that hadn't fully thawed. The trial lasted 1 afternoon. The verdict took considerably less time than it took Nora to ride from her place on the edge of town to the courthouse steps, hanging scheduled for Friday at noon. This was Wednesday evening. Nora stood at the window of her small house and watched the sky turn the color of old rust at the horizon and tried to identify the source of the feeling, sitting wrong and persistent in her chest, like a splinter, driven too deep to reach with fingers. She'd barely known Cole Briggs, barely spoken 40 words to him across 2 brief encounters that neither of them had probably thought about since. But something refused to settle. Deputy Hicks had enemies. Real ones. Documented ones if you knew where the documentation was kept, and who kept it, and why it never quite made it into official records, where it might have caused problems for the wrong people. Men who'd had land seized through liens that appeared legitimate on paper and dissolved under scrutiny that never quite happened because scrutiny required someone willing to do the scrutinizing. Men who'd had cattle impounded on technicalities that benefited ranchers with more money and more connections than the men being impounded. Men who'd had debts called in at precise moments that seemed calculated to cause maximum damage, and whose timing corresponded suspiciously with the interests of men who had reason to want certain parcels cleared and certain families moved along. Hicks hadn't been clean. Everyone in Caldwell Creek knew it, even if nobody said it at a volume that carried beyond their own kitchen, because saying it at any volume that carried had consequences, and consequences in Caldwell Creek tended to be swift and disproportionate, and dressed up in the same legal language that made everything else here sound reasonable. Cole Briggs had no motive anyone had actually established, no history with Hicks on record, no reason that the prosecutor had bothered to construct beyond the bandana and the horse, and the fact that Cole had been sleeping 3 hours later, when sleeping after 14 hours of hard physical labor, was not, in any rational understanding of human behavior, evidence of guilt. But he had been convenient, and Caldwell Creek moved fast when convenience presented itself. Nora pulled on her coat and went to find her horse. The Lattimore Ranch sat 4 miles east of town on flat land that caught the wind from every direction and provided nothing in the way of natural shelter or comfort. Old man Lattimore had built it that way deliberately. He'd believed that comfort made men soft, and soft men made bad ranchers, and bad ranchers went broke, which was the one outcome he'd organized his entire life around avoiding. His son Gerald had inherited the land and the buildings and the cattle, and approximately none of his father's philosophy, replacing it instead with a talent for acquiring things through mechanisms that were technically legal if you squinted at them from the right angle and didn't ask too many questions about the process. Nora rode out in the last of the light, pushing her horse harder than the soft ground warranted. Gerald met her at the gate with his arms crossed, and his expression already forming the particular shape it made when he was deciding how much of his time something was worth. "Miss Hale." Flat, not welcoming. "I need to look at Cole's bunk," Nora said. Gerald's eyes narrowed incrementally. "Trial's done." "Hanging isn't." He looked at her the way men in Caldwell Creek looked at women who said things that created inconvenience, like she was a problem to be managed rather than a person making a point. "His gear's still in the bunkhouse," Gerald said after a moment that felt calculated. "Nobody bothered moving it. Not worth the effort." He stepped aside with the specific grace of a man who believed he had nothing to hide, because he believed the things he'd done were simply how business worked. The bunkhouse smelled like every bunkhouse Nora had ever been near: sweat and leather and the accumulated staleness of men living in close quarters through seasons that didn't care about their comfort. Cole's bunk was at the far end, near the window that looked out toward the north pasture. Neat. Spare. A bedroll rolled tight and precise, the way a man kept things when long experience had taught him that assuming things would stay where you left them was an assumption that got corrected eventually. Under the bunk, a saddlebag. Old leather worn dark and supple with years of use. Brass buckles oxidized green at the edges, the kind of bag that had covered serious distance and wasn't done yet. Nora sat on the edge of the bunk and unbuckled it with hands that were steadier than she felt. Inside, a spare shirt folded with military precision, a piece of oilcloth wrapped around something small and hard, a leather coin pouch with modest weight, a photograph of 2 people standing in front of a farmhouse in flat country she didn't recognize, their expressions carrying the particular stiffness of people who weren't sure how to be photographed and were trying too hard at it. And at the very bottom of the bag, folded small and tight with the deliberate compression of something someone had wanted to make as invisible as possible without actually destroying it. A letter. Nora unfolded it slowly. The paper was thin at the creases from repeated folding, and unfolding. The handwriting was cramped and pressed hard into the page, slanting right, in the way of someone self-taught who'd never quite gotten comfortable with the mechanics of putting words down. She read it once straight through, then again from the beginning, then a third time with her hands trembling against the paper and the splinter in her chest suddenly resolving from vague unease into something sharp and specific and impossible to ignore. The letter was addressed to Cole by first name only. It was signed by a man named Tate Garrow, and it was a confession. If you want to hear more stories from the frontier, stories of ordinary people who refuse to let the wrong thing stand, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell so you never miss one. We bring you a new story every week from the history the history books forgot. Now let's get back to Nora and find out what that letter said. She read the words again in the dim bunkhouse light, her breath coming shallow and careful, like she was afraid to disturb them. Cole, if you're reading this, it means I didn't reach you in time to say it face to face, and saying it in a letter is the coward's way, but it's the only way I have left. I shot Warren Hicks. I shot him on Tuesday night behind the feed store, and I left him there, and I am not going to tell you. I feel nothing about it because that would be a lie, and I've told enough lies already. I shot him because 3 years ago he filed a lien against my brother Daniel's property on behalf of Gerald Lattimore. The lien was fraudulent. The paperwork was constructed to look legitimate, and it wasn't, and Hicks knew it wasn't because Lattimore paid him to know it and look the other way and sign his name to it anyway. Daniel had no money for a lawyer who could fight it in the time he had. He lost the land. He lost everything he'd built on it. Last winter, he died of exposure, sleeping in a line shack on property that used to be his because he had nowhere else to go and too much pride to ask for help and too much grief to fight anymore. I made a decision after the funeral. I left your bandana near Hicks because I knew you'd been making noise about the north pasture boundary line, and I thought it would point attention somewhere else long enough for me to clear the territory. I was wrong to do it, Cole. I was wrong about a lot of things. I'm gone by the time you read this. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed someone to know the truth, even if the truth can't fix anything now. Tate Garrow. Nora sat without moving for a long time. Outside the bunkhouse window, the last light had finished dying, and the stars were coming out hard and cold above the flat, dark line of the horizon. Cole Briggs was sitting in a jail cell in Caldwell Creek with a hanging scheduled for Friday noon. The man who had actually shot Warren Hicks was somewhere south or west or north of here, riding hard toward distance he believed would be sufficient. And she was sitting on a dead man's bunk, holding the proof that would make the difference between an innocent man living and an innocent man buried. She folded the letter carefully and pressed it flat against her chest inside her coat. Then she stood up, buckled the saddlebag exactly as she'd found it, and walked back through the dark to where her horse was tied. Gerald Lattimore was still at the gate, waiting with the patient confidence of a man who expected to be told nothing had been found. "Anything?" he asked. Nora looked at him directly, thought about his name written in Tate Garrow's cramped hand, thought about Daniel Garrow dying in a line shack on land that had once been his. "Nothing worth mentioning," she said, and rode hard back toward town. She went to Sheriff Aldous first, because procedure mattered even when procedure was frustrating, and going around it created problems that came back later, wearing worse faces. Aldous was 62 years old, with 19 years behind the badge in Caldwell Creek, and the particular brand of certainty that came from spending nearly 2 decades in a job where doubt was a liability, and decisiveness was survival. He read the letter, set it down, looked at Nora across his desk with eyes that had the quality of a man who had decided long ago what kind of stories he was willing to let himself believe. "This doesn't change the verdict," he said. "It's a confession from the actual killer. It's an unsigned document from a man nobody can locate, making claims about a deputy who cannot respond to them." He pushed the letter back. "Could be fabricated. Could be someone helping Briggs muddy water that's already settled. It names Gerald Lattimore in a fraudulent land scheme." The shift in Aldis's expression was small and brief, but Nora caught it because she'd been watching for exactly that. "Gerald Lattimore is a respected member of this community," Nora said, getting there before him. "I know. I've heard that sentence applied to men who didn't deserve it before." Aldis stood up slowly with the deliberate movement of a man ending a conversation. "Miss Hale, I'd think carefully about where you take this and what you say when you get there. Accusations against men of standing have a way of returning to the people who made them." Nora picked up the letter. "Then I'll find someone who moves slower than this town does," she said. Judge Paris answered his door in his shirt sleeves, with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the expression of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something he ranked above most things that knocked on his door after dark. He read the letter without comment. "Read it again." "Where did you find this?" "Cole Briggs' Saddlebag, Lattimore Ranch bunkhouse." "You removed it from the premises." "I preserved material evidence in a capital case," Nora said. "I'd make the same distinction to anyone who asked." Paris studied her over his glasses, with the evaluating quality of a man deciding how much of what he was seeing was genuine and how much was performance. "You understand the implications of what this letter says about Gerald Lattimore." "I understand what Tate Garrow wrote. I'm not drawing implications. I'm presenting you with a document and asking you to do your job." Something moved through Paris's expression that might have been respect, or might have been irritation. In her experience, the two looked similar on men who weren't accustomed to being spoken to directly by women. Somewhere above them a floorboard creaked. His wife. Listening through the ceiling, the way women listened in houses where the decisions made affected everyone, but were made by one. "I can issue a stay," Paris said finally. "Pending proper investigation. That's all I'm prepared to do tonight." "A stay is enough," Nora said. "Tonight." The stay reached the jail at 10 Thursday morning. Nora stood at the bars while the deputy read it to Cole in the flat, official voice of someone delivering information he hadn't been asked to have feelings about. Cole listened without moving. When the deputy finished and walked back to his desk, Cole looked at Nora through the bars with eyes that had the quality of a man who had spent 3 weeks making peace with something and was now being asked to unmake it. "You found something," he said. "A letter. Tate Garrow." Cole closed his eyes briefly. "He told me once about his brother," Cole said quietly. "About the land. About what Hicks did." He opened his eyes. "I didn't know he'd gone that far. No one did. A stay isn't freedom. No, but it's time. And time is what we need." Cole looked at his hands resting on his knees. "Why did you look?" he asked. The question was simple and genuine, and carried no expectation behind it. Just honest curiosity about a thing he couldn't fully explain to himself. Nora thought about the fence line conversation, the way he'd listened, the way he'd spoken carefully when he finally spoke. "Because fast isn't the same as right," she said. "And I've watched this town move fast my whole life and call it justice when it was usually just convenience." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "That's not much to stake a man's life on," he said finally. "It was enough to make me look," Nora replied, "and looking was enough." The federal marshal arrived from the territorial capital 4 days later, a lean, quiet man named Devereaux who asked precise questions and wrote the answers in a small leather notebook and gave away nothing about what he was thinking until he was ready to tell you. He interviewed Nora for 2 hours, read the letter 3 times, rode out to the Lattimore Ranch, and spent an afternoon there that Gerald described afterward to anyone who would listen as a misunderstanding that would be cleared up shortly. It was not cleared up shortly. Devereaux sent for territorial lawyers who specialized in land documentation. They arrived a week later and spent 3 days examining the lien filed against Daniel Garrow's property with the focused attention of people who knew exactly what fraudulent paperwork looked like because they'd seen enough of it to recognize the specific ways it tried to disguise itself as legitimate. The lien dissolved under examination like paper in rain, constructed with just enough authentic language to pass a quick reading and not enough structural integrity to survive a careful one. Tate Garrow was located in New Mexico territory 11 days after Devereaux began looking. Not far enough south, it turned out, for a man who had left a written confession in a saddlebag he'd known would eventually be found. He surrendered without resistance, confessed again in person with the particular exhausted relief of someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and was finally setting it down regardless of what happened next. Gerald Lattimore was arrested on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Nora had ridden out to the Lattimore Ranch in the last of the evening light, looking for something she couldn't name yet. He stood on his porch and watched Devereaux come up the road with 2 deputies and the territorial lawyers, and the specific expression of a man discovering for the first time that the protections he'd always assumed were permanent had an expiration date he hadn't been informed of. Cole Briggs walked out of Caldwell Creek jail on a Friday morning, the same Friday he'd been scheduled to hang. He stood on the street in the early light with his saddlebag over one shoulder and his hat in his hand, and squinted at the sky with the particular quality of attention a man gives to ordinary things when he's recently been reminded that ordinary things are not guaranteed. Nora was waiting across the street. He crossed to her, reached into his coat, and produced the letter, still folded, slightly worn at the edges now from handling. He held it out. "You should have this," he said. Nora shook her head. "It's yours. It was always yours." Cole looked at the letter for a moment, then tucked it back into his coat. "Tate's going to prison," he said. "Yes. He killed a man. He did. Hicks wasn't clean." "No," Nora agreed. "But Tate didn't have the right." "No," Cole said quietly. "He didn't." They stood on the main street of Caldwell Creek, while the town woke up around them. Doors opening, horses moving past. The unremarkable sounds of a place that had nearly hanged an innocent man and would be moving fast toward the next thing before the week was out. "You didn't know me," Cole said, still carrying that, still turning it over, trying to understand the shape of it. "I knew enough." "What did you know?" Nora considered the question honestly. "I knew you went to sleep," she said. "After 14 hours of work, you went to sleep in the livery, and that's where they found you. Guilty men don't do that. Guilty men run, or they make themselves loud about their innocence, or they disappear into the territory. You went to sleep because you were tired, and you had nothing to run from." She paused. "That was enough to make me look. Looking was enough to find the letter. The letter was enough to stop the hanging." Cole studied her face for a long moment. "Simple as that," he said. "Simple as that." He put his hat on, adjusted the brim against the morning light. "I'm leaving Caldwell Creek," he said. "I know. Town doesn't forget that it almost hanged you. Makes every interaction after that carry weight it shouldn't." "I know," Nora said. Cole nodded once, the same quiet nod he'd given her at the general store 8 months ago when he'd held the door open and not made anything of it. He started walking toward the livery. Stopped after a few steps, turned back. "Nora." He said her name the way people said names when they wanted to make sure they'd remember them correctly. "Thank you." She nodded. He walked on. She watched him move through Caldwell Creek, past the feed store where Hicks had fallen, past the courthouse where 12 men had decided his fate in an afternoon, past the jail where he'd spent 3 weeks in a cell making peace with a Friday that had come and gone without him, and out to the edge of town where the road opened into 4 directions, and a man with a good horse could choose any of them. He chose south. The dust his horse raised settled slowly in the still morning air. Then the road was empty, and Caldwell Creek was already moving on to whatever came next. It always did. But a man was riding south on a Friday morning that was supposed to be his last, and Nora Hale stood on the main street with a town full of fast decisions around her and the quiet, particular satisfaction of someone who had slowed things down just long enough for the truth to catch up. Sometimes that was the whole of justice. Not a grand verdict rendered from a high bench, not a confession extracted under pressure, just a woman who noticed something wrong and went looking in a saddlebag in a bunkhouse in the last of the evening light, and found enough.